Hello, welcome to the 2019 Project WAfLS annual webinar, results webinar. I'm Robert Miller. I'm the project lead for Project WAfLS, predicting responses of short-eared owl population size distribution and habitat use in a changing climate. So let's get started. Before I do, I should probably acknowledge that there should be many co-authors listed on this. We have the state coordinators in each of the 8 states, sometimes representing multiple organizations, and we have the overall program management from the Pacific Flyway Council, as well as a number of other people, and of course the 800 plus volunteers who have contributed to this program to date. So thank all of you, even though I cannot mention you individually. So why are we interested in this? Booms et al. Published a paper in 2014 suggesting there's been a range-wide long-term population decline in North America, that the weight of evidence is convincing, but because we're using insufficient survey methodologies, the magnitude of that decline is unclear, and that better survey information is necessary. So Travis came to the Idaho Bird Conservation Partnership and convinced us to get this started, and it's grown from 1 state to 2 to 4 to 8. And as you know now, Project WAfLS is having a pretty large influence. So our conservation priorities were, Booms et al. Identified 6 of those, and we are really looking to contribute to the first 4. Define and protect important habitats, improve population monitoring, evaluate and determine what the seasonal movements are of this species, one of the things that makes it difficult to study, and develop management plans and tools. So with that paper, Travis came along to the Idaho Bird Conservation Partnership and influenced us to start up this initiative that has become Project WAfLS. QR code's linked to our website. It'll be on the final slide as well. So our Project WAfLS objectives are to quantify the population size in each participating state, to quantify how those populations fluctuate spatially and temporally, and this particular year gave us some challenges in that regard. This species is particularly noteworthy for being an eruptive breeder and having a low site fidelity, which makes surveying it quite difficult, as some of you know. To identify the distribution, habitat use, grazing, and climate influences on the population, and to generate statistically rigorous projections for this species based upon our future projections of climate and land use changes. And then, most importantly of all, implement high-value conservation actions. So our survey area is the 8 western states within the lower 48. The blue region here is the strata. This is the location that we believe that 90%, greater than 90% of the short-eared owls in the west reside. And the black is our spatially balanced survey locations, at least 50 of those in each participating state. This program is largely a volunteer-driven program. We engage over 600 participants every year, over 800 since in the 5 years since this program began. So it really could not be done without all of you participating, going out and completing your survey routes and contributing the data. So our 2019 survey results, if you look at the left column here, you can see the rundown of how many of our regular grids. Regular grids are the spatially balanced statistical grids that were chosen randomly or in a balanced fashion. And we surveyed 344 of those and found short-eared owls on 57 of them. 273 of those routes were surveyed twice, which is our goal. We also have some hotspot routes. These are locations where we expect to find short-eared owls. These are prime habitat, wildlife management areas, national wildlife refuges, etc. And they were not chosen randomly, so they can't be used in the statistical analysis, but we do like to survey them to get relative abundance in those areas year to year. So this is where we found this year. The black dots are negative survey locations, and the red dots are places that short-eared owls were detected on survey. And it doesn't really show here, but compared to the previous years, we had a northward and eastward shift in our detections. Eastern Montana really dominating the scene here, which provides me some challenges in the data analysis, and that's one reason that the data that I'm presenting today is provisional on some additional analysis techniques that I'm still investigating to address that spatial shift into a different type of habitat. So I'm going to talk through results at a point level and at a survey level. So a survey is a 6-mile stretch of road that consists of 8 to 11 survey points, each separated by a half mile. So at the point level, it's given that there is an owl somewhere on that 6-mile, within a kilometer of that 6-mile stretch of road, what's the chance that it's at the given point? And counter to our results in some of our previous years, shrubs, both low shrubs and high shrubs, came up with a negative association. And this is a result of it being diluted by the eastern Montana grassland results. So with a lot more detections up there and fewer detections in the south, our habitat analysis shifted. So I'll be working on a more sophisticated analysis that will help bridge that shift. Shifting on to complex grassland, this is something that we've shown to have a weak effect, positive effect in years past, but it came out very strongly, but not 100%. So points that had complex grassland with another habitat type, most often agriculture, is where we tend to find these birds. So more is not always better for these guys. And it may speak to their need for heterogeneous prey, but it may also speak that their prey and hunting lands requirements are different than their nesting and displaying requirements. So that may drive this 100% is not always better view that this graph shows. And then lastly, at the point scale, we found at least up to 10% grazed, didn't really have much negative effect, but once you got up around 40%, we were much less likely to find short-eared owls at that point. This is consistent with our results from last year. It's somewhat counter to some other research that has shown that they're completely incompatible with grazing. And our own grouse and grazing program that has integrated short-eared owls has actually shown that they're not incompatible, at least at low grazing levels. So this is an important finding that low levels of grazing are okay, too much is a problem. Now let's shift up to the overall survey. So what's the chance that there's an owl on somewhere along the 6-mile stretch of survey? And it increases with more and more grassland. Now that is this counter to the complex grassland picture earlier? Not really. So this only goes up. We didn't have any surveys with 100% grassland within a kilometer of the survey. It only goes up to about 78%. And so at that level, it says that there's something else out there making up 22% even of all of these grids, and we are finding them along that route on that interface where both of those habitats exist. So habitat heterogeneity, sure, complex grassland is a good thing, and more of it is a good thing to a point. But that other component is also important. This is the first year that we split out agriculture into hay and fallow agriculture, into row crop agriculture, and into orchard, vines, berry crop agriculture. And the hay fallow ag land came out very strongly indeed. So really representing something similar to that complex grassland component that they seem to be associated with. The orchards and vines, and I've heard this from some of you in the past, we didn't have any data, now we do. Orchards and vines aren't really a good habitat for them. at least in our results. The more orchards and vines, even up to 20%, if there's 20% orchards and vines, we aren't finding short-eared owls there. And this was interesting because other short-eared owl studies have found use of trees by short-eared owls. The Hawaiian subspecies, the pueo, roosts in trees regularly. The Argentina subspecies moves into trees during certain prey breakouts, like I forget what type of vole they have down there, that when a certain flower flowers, the rodent population explodes and the owls move out of the open country into the forest to hunt. So we wanted to keep the orchard and vine question in there, but we are getting answers suggesting that orchards and vines are negative. Now the confidence interval does increase here as we go up to the right, which says there's uncertainty when we get that up to 20% orchards and vines. So something that we'll continue to look at in the future. So what does it all mean when we look at occupancy? So this is the percentage of our routes that have a short-eared owl on them. And this accounts for imperfect detection, which means we don't have to have detected a short-eared owl there. We know that there's some percentage of routes we surveyed that had short-eared owls, we just didn't detect them, because our detection rate for short-eared owls, given that they're there, is only about 50%. So this is the percentage of those surveyed routes that we expect have short-eared owls. And going back to 2015 for Idaho. So we see 15 was the best year for Idaho, 16 a little bit lower, 17 was a poor year. We bounced back in 18 and dropped off a little bit in 19. Utah kind of had a good 16 year, declined, and they're on an upswing, as is Wyoming. Washington, between the last 2 years, went up dramatically, but not as dramatically as Montana. So Montana had a lot of short-eared owls, and if you ask anybody up there, they saw them much more often. So what we see is a increase in the northern and the eastern states and a decrease in the southern and western states. Decrease in Nevada, California, Idaho, and Oregon year over year. So this is one of the objectives that we had in initiating this program, was to really look at how these shifts are taking place. And once we look at it at an 8-state level, do we see the numbers, population numbers, being somewhat stabilized? And we do here. So while 4 of the states had measured decline this year, 4 of them had an increase, and overall we did a little bit better in 2019 than 2018, most of it in Washington and Montana. So it's why we had to look across 8 states, and it's why we have to look for multiple years. So if you've seen these before, we're able to project with our results and our habitat analysis. We're integrated with climate, we're able to project where we think the short-eared owls land occupy, and sure enough, Montana comes in very strong. And this is using all of our years of data, not just 2019. So Montana's always been strong up in the upper right. Eastern Idaho, Washington has quite a bit of habitat. The Willamette Valley, over in Oregon, if you went back and looked at where those detections were, we did very well there. Now, taking that same climate model, or same habitat model, and projecting it forward with climate, and this is going to be a conservative view in that we have not changed the land use. We've assumed that no more habitat is lost, and we've assumed that the climate doesn't necessarily change the habitat, which we don't expect to occur, but we do expect the climate to change the habitat. So this is kind of a very conservative view that I'm about to show. And it's conservative further in that it assumes that we do significant greenhouse gas reduction over what our current trend. So our current trend picture looks much worse than this. But this is what the projection looks like going out into 2070, assuming that the climate changes, but land use does not, and that composition does not and that we make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of chain of assumptions there. If we look at what this means, though, if we say arbitrarily the viability above 50% is good, we see that this is a 34% decrease in the amount of area that is considered good. And then if we say above 0.8 viability is great, this is a more than 2/3 reduction in the bright green is what this looks at. So how to equate it is we're having more than a 2/3 decrease in the bright green, which is the best habitat. So clearly we have some work to do from a conservation perspective. Maintaining those areas of great habitat, definitely looking into our wildlife management areas and national refuge system, which seems to be a hotbed for this species, etc. So stay tuned on that front. I want to shift gears now and talk about the conservation issues and what's data we have on that. And we're going to look at 3 different scales: the intermediate, direct mortality from human activities; the midterm, land use changes; and the intermediate to long term, which is that climate picture I just showed. Roadway mortality. We continue to get more and more roadway mortality data coming in. Short-eared owls continue to be killed along rural roads with very little traffic, but when that traffic comes, it comes at very high rates of speed. We piloted a formal survey method at 3 locations in Idaho this year, also volunteer-driven, where they surveyed each week for 8 weeks along the routes in a way to try to quantify the impact, to see if this mortality is additive or what we call compensatory. Are these birds that would have died anyway? It's tragic that they're being killed this way in a car, but from a population level, is it additive mortality or not? So look forward to more information on that. But roadway mortality continues to be a problem. Fence line collisions continue to be a problem. We have multiple instances of this. I think we've documented 3. There's been a lot of work in Idaho to flag fence lines because greater sage grouse also die on fence lines. So we expect this is a bigger issue, maybe not a huge issue. We don't know, once again, if it's additive. Mowing and tilling agriculture is a problem for this species. Their nests get destroyed, particularly in alfalfa. So the first alfalfa harvest tends to coincide with the nesting phase. Short-eared owls like to build their nests in alfalfa, and then the harvester comes and destroys the nest. This particular bird, good story, I guess, was hit by a combine in Montana, spent months in the rehabilitation center, and our partner up there helped release it last week, Owl Research Institute. So this is one that was rescued, but it's just further proof that this does happen, and it primarily impacts nests, or in this case, young birds. Aircraft strikes. A paper was just published in 2018 by Linnell and Washburn, showing that short-eared owls are disproportionately impacted by aircraft strikes, a lot of times at these smaller airports. So Twin Falls Airport in Idaho, for example, has had multiple reports. And this is a conservative estimate because this is voluntary reporting. The military are required to report it, but civilian airports are not required to report it. But if you think about a habitat, the grassland, the available species, airports might be attractive, especially airports with not a lot of planes coming in and out. But 20% of owl species picked up in the US at airports are short-eared owls. This stock tank, we know 4 birds died in southern Idaho. We don't know if this occurs much how widespread this is across the landscape. It may or may not be additive, something we'd be interested into. There are solutions for this. It's unfortunate that this grazer chose not to implement those. Rodenticide, we have not within our area studied rodenticides yet. We expect that it is a problem because every raptor species that has been studied for rodenticides is finding them positive. So a number of statistics, 85% of raptors that were killed in a study in California, and they were killed by wind turbine or car, whatever, 85% of those were dosed with rodenticide prior to their death. So they were probably, some of those were probably already dying when they stepped in front of a car, et cetera. This study here in the table 7 is from our partners in Hawaii that have just completed a survey of a number of different species, including the pueo, which is the Hawaiian short-eared owl. And they found this BROD and BROM, or second generation rodenticides. They were finding that about 10 to 20% of the short-eared owls collected were testing positive for that. Once again, these aren't owls that they thought were poisoned. These are owls that were involved in car collisions or some other death caught by domestic animals, etc. But then were tested and found to have second generation rodenticide. Some of them have warfarin, which is a first generation rodenticide that is still being used there on a few islands apparently. So rodenticide is a problem. We expect it's a problem across all 8 states because it's used widely in each of those states. So let's shift to the medium term. The medium term risks are the loss of native landscapes and fragmentation of the native landscapes. But wait, we know that these birds are found in agricultural areas, and maybe our landscape conversion is helping them because agricultural areas do have higher prey abundance. So, and they seem to be somewhat friendly to agriculture. So that's a possibility. Show the grazing chart here again. Grazing up to 20% doesn't appear to be catastrophic, so you know, they aren't completely incompatible with that land use either. So we see them somewhat tolerant to some of these influences. But I do want to talk about how I view this overall and how we're trying to put this in perspective to evaluate our future research questions. So this chart has habitat quality, high on the left, low on the right, across the top, and the birds' selection, whether they prefer it on the upper row or avoid it on the lower row. So we believe that, that historically they preferred non-fragmented, lightly grazed, native shrublands and complex grasslands, and that provided high quality habitat for them. That all sounds great, except that we came in, we fragmented it, we graze it beyond 20%. We've allowed it to be invaded with cheatgrass and other invasive species. So we think that habitat has moved to low quality and is now being avoided by the species. So what's replacing it up here? Cropland and lightly grazed lands. They're preferring it. Maybe it's not quite as high quality, but it's got some advantages like higher prey abundance. So I put it in that top row because they're clearly associating there, and that's what our data is showing us. However, we just talked about all of these issues. So they're being attracted into that cropland for its structure, attracted there for its prey availability. However, it introduces them to cars, airplanes, fences, rodenticides, plows, and tanks. And so I would argue that that is making that cropland low quality. So they're preferring it, but it's low quality, and it's what we call an ecological trap. And that's where they get seduced into an area and they don't note the risks that are there, and then they suffer from those risks. And that suffer may be not the adults dying, it may be that their nests are being plowed under, that they're raising young and those young are going off and immediately being killed on the road type of thing. So we think we're presenting an ecological trap, and this may be the factor that is explaining the perceived decline in the species overall. So that's the framework I'm using to look at our research going forward. And then long-term climate influences. Sorry to leave on such a sad note, but let's talk about next steps. One, we have another year of survey season to go in 2020. We want to, as we know, each year of this, we have discovered very important information that has informed our perspective, and we expect next year will be no different. That shift a couple years from the east to the west, and then from the west to the northeast, what does next year hold for us? Assembling the stakeholders to drive conservation actions. This is underway right now. The Pacific Flyway has a subgroup that's working on this. I'm working in conjunction with them. Colleen Moulton, John Alexander of Klamath Bird Observatory, and Travis Booms of Alaska Fish and Wildlife are all working to pull that stakeholder group to really prioritize and drive conservation actions for this species. And we're going to have our first meeting in December of the whole stakeholder group. Complete the analysis of the effects of various grazing practices on short-eared owl breeding. This is kind of a sub-project, the grouse and grazing program you've heard me talk about with the University of Idaho. They've completed 2 years of surveys on their grouse and grazing program for short-eared owls. That's how we also know that short-eared owls are not incompatible with grazing. But we're getting to the next level of analysis now that we have 2 years of that data in. So we'll be working on that. There's some land use and movement data available from other studies that have been assembled. Owl Research Institute, Travis out of Alaska, in New York and in Iowa. Movement and land use patterns have been analyzed. We are going to aggregate that data, but also look at new data collection. So we are looking at putting out some transmitters on birds this coming year, really looking at their association between this complex landscapes, these borders between different landscape types, and their avoidance or association with those risks that we identified in the ecological trap. So that's really the priority of this item. And then quantify each of those threats as either additive or compensatory. I mentioned Project WAfLS, which was the presence of road-killed owls, was that pilot project we did in Idaho looking for roadway mortality. And we did find short-eared owls on official roadway mortality surveys in that program. Looking at how we can grow that program to really quantify the effect of our roadways on this species. So with that, I just want to acknowledge our funders, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, through their state wildlife grant program, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for managing that grant on our behalf, the Pacific Flyway Council Non-Game Technical Committee that helped us get that grant funding to really get this program going, and they're driving the stakeholder group participation. So they're really the recipients of all the work that you and I have done, so that they can work on those conservation actions. All the state coordinators, I can't thank them all enough, or the organizations that they work for, and most importantly of all, the more than 800 volunteer surveyors out there who have put their money on the line, put their time and mileage to get this done. They've dealt with things like our less than usable data entry portal this year. By the way, significant improvements will happen next year in that front, etc. So I just can't thank them enough. This whole program is based on the backs of those volunteer surveyors. So thank you. And here's a link to our website. I guess the QR code is, if you search for Project WAfLS online, you'll get taken to our website. And as always, you can contact me via email. Robert Miller, digit7@boisestate.edu. I'm really interested if you have any feedback on this presentation or have any questions. You can address them to me or on our public or private Facebook page. We have a private Facebook group for surveyors, volunteer participants. But either our public or private page is fine. So with that, I will say thank you, and I appreciate your time and your contributions to this program. Take care.